There's a building in Brooklyn that changed millions of lives. Not because of what happened inside its walls, but because of what it promised outside of them. When someone says Bethel, they're not just talking about bricks and mortar. They're talking about a symbol that shaped destinies, redirected careers, and rewrote family trees. For decades, Bethel wasn't just a headquarters. It was the physical manifestation of a promise, that if you gave your life to this work, you were giving it to the most important mission on earth. But here's the question that opens this documentary. If Bethel was built to send a message to the world, what was the real message being sent inside those walls? Today, we're going back to the beginning. Brooklyn, New York. 1909. The original Bethel. The foundation of everything that would follow. But to understand what Bethel became, we first need to understand what it was designed to be. And more importantly, we need to understand the gap between design and reality, between promise and delivery, between the vision sold and the experience lived. This isn't just architectural history. This is about how buildings become symbols, how symbols become authority, and how authority shapes the choices of people who believe they were choosing freely. This is about the psychology of sacred spaces, the power of institutional identity, and what happens when the edifice that promised permanence reveals itself to be just as temporary as everything else. Let's start with a word. A simple Hebrew word that carries more weight than most people realize. Bethel. House of God. 2 syllables that do extraordinary psychological work. It's not accidental that this name was chosen. It's not poetic decoration or religious window dressing. It's strategic framing that accomplishes something profound before a single doctrine is taught or a single publication is printed. When you name a place, House of God, you're not just giving it an address. You're placing that location above ordinary criticism, above normal organizational scrutiny, above the standards we'd apply to any human institution. Think about what happens in your mind when you hear that phrase. House of God doesn't just mean religious building. It doesn't simply indicate place where believers gather. It suggests divine presence, sacred ground, a place where heaven meets earth. It carries echoes of biblical history, of Jacob's ladder, of revelation and transformation. It invokes the weight of Scripture, the authority of ancient covenant, the promise of divine encounter. Before anyone sets foot inside, before a single organizational policy is explained, before any commitment is requested, the name has already done half the work of creating reverence. And that reverence is crucial, because it transforms what might otherwise be seen as a corporate headquarters, an administrative center, or a publishing house into something that feels untouchable, beyond question, divinely appointed. This linguistic move, this naming strategy, set the foundation for everything that followed. Because once you establish that a place is sacred, every decision made there gains an aura of divine sanction. Every policy becomes theocratic direction. Every administrative choice becomes spiritual guidance. Every organizational restructuring becomes Jehovah's arrangement. The building itself becomes evidence of God's blessing, and questioning the building, or what happens inside it, becomes tantamount to questioning God Himself. This is the power of sacred architecture, and it's been understood by religious movements throughout human history. Temples, cathedrals, shrines, holy sites, they all serve a dual function. Yes, they're practical spaces for gathering and ceremony. But more importantly, they're psychological anchors. They make abstract belief tangible. They give invisible faith a visible home. They transform doctrine into destination. But Bethel wasn't always the institutional complex we came to know. It started much smaller, much simpler, in an era when religious movements were springing up across America like wildflowers after rain, each promising to restore true Christianity, each claiming to have discovered what centuries of tradition had obscured. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a remarkable time in American religious history. The Second Great Awakening had planted seeds of religious enthusiasm that were still bearing fruit decades later. The country was experiencing rapid industrialization, massive immigration, urbanization, and social upheaval. Traditional structures were being challenged. Old certainties were being questioned. And into this fertile ground came movements like Adventism, Pentecostalism, Christian Science, and the Bible students who would eventually become Jehovah's Witnesses. What united many of these movements was a conviction that mainstream Christianity had lost its way, that the truth needed to be recovered, that the end times were approaching, and that God was raising up a special group to proclaim final warnings before the culmination of human history. Charles Taze Russell fit perfectly into this pattern. Born in 1852 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Russell was the son of a successful businessman. He was raised Presbyterian but became disillusioned with traditional Christian teachings, particularly the doctrines of hellfire and predestination. As a young man, he encountered Adventist ideas about Christ's second coming, and this encounter transformed his life. Russell wasn't a traditional religious figure. He didn't attend seminary. He wasn't ordained by any established church. He had no formal theological training. But what he lacked in credentials, he made up for in conviction, charisma, and organizational ability. He was fundamentally a businessman who applied business principles to religion, and this combination would prove extraordinarily powerful. By the 1870s, Russell had begun organizing Bible study groups in Pittsburgh. He was convinced that mainstream Christianity had strayed from biblical truth, that the Bible could be understood through careful study without the filter of traditional theology, and that the end times were rapidly approaching. His movement, initially called the Bible Students, was built on the idea of returning to pure biblical teaching, free from what he saw as the corruptions of Catholic and Protestant traditions. But Russell understood something that many religious visionaries miss: ideas need infrastructure. Truth, as he saw it, needed a home. Faith needed facilities. A movement needed more than just meetings in living rooms and rented halls. To be taken seriously, to grow beyond a local phenomenon, to reach the world with what you believe is a life or death message, you need institutional presence. And Russell had another insight, one that would prove crucial to everything that followed: the power of publishing. If you could control the printing and distribution of religious literature, you could shape the message with unprecedented precision. You could reach people you'd never meet. You could speak into homes across continents. You could build a movement that didn't depend on charismatic preachers in every location but on consistent, controlled, centralized messaging. In 1879, Russell began publishing what would become the Watchtower magazine. This wasn't just another religious periodical. It was the voice of the movement, the authoritative source for biblical interpretation, the means by which Russell's ideas could spread far beyond Pittsburgh. And as the circulation grew, as subscribers multiplied, as the movement expanded, the need for a permanent headquarters became not just desirable but necessary. So Bethel was born, not as a grand complex initially, but as a concept that would grow with the movement. The vision was presented in spiritual terms: a home for dedicated Christians, a place where believers could work full-time in the service of God, a center from which the gospel could be proclaimed to the world. But beneath the spiritual framing was practical calculation. Russell needed a base of operations. He needed control over publishing. He needed a way to coordinate and direct a growing international movement. The year 1909 marks the official inauguration of the Brooklyn Bethel, though Russell had established organizational presence in the area earlier. And the choice of Brooklyn wasn't made by casting lots or seeking divine revelation. It was made for hard-headed business reasons that reveal just how much practical calculation went into this supposedly spirit-directed enterprise. Brooklyn in the early 20th century was an ideal location for what Russell had in mind. It was one of the major printing and publishing centers in the United States, with established networks of printers, suppliers, and distributors. It had the industrial infrastructure necessary for mass production of literature. The waterfront provided access to shipping routes for international distribution. The transportation networks meant literature could be moved efficiently throughout the country and the world. And real estate, while not cheap, was more affordable than Manhattan while still providing proximity to New York City's resources and prestige. This was logistics dressed in providence. This was efficiency baptized as divine direction. And that pattern, the blending of smart business strategy with religious authority, the presentation of practical decisions as spiritual guidance, would define Bethel's entire history. It's a pattern we see repeatedly in high-control religious organizations. The sacralization of the strategic, the transformation of organizational needs into divine will. For the early Bible students, having a Bethel meant something profound. It meant legitimacy in a religious marketplace crowded with movements that appeared and disappeared within a generation. It meant they weren't just another splinter group meeting in rented halls. They had permanence. They had headquarters. They had what looked like institutional stability. They had a house of God with an actual address. And the psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. When you can point to an impressive building and say, "That's our headquarters," you're making a statement about your movement's validity, its permanence, its divine approval. The building becomes proof. It becomes evidence that this isn't a fringe movement operating out of someone's basement. It's real. It's established. It's blessed by God. But Bethel's real transformation, the shift that would define it for the next century, came after Russell's death in 1916. And to understand this transformation, we need to understand the man who engineered it, Joseph Franklin Rutherford. If Russell was the visionary prophet, Rutherford was the organizational architect. If Russell built a movement on biblical interpretation and millennial expectations, Rutherford built an institution on control, hierarchy, and absolute centralized authority. And the difference between these two men, their personalities and their approaches, reveals something crucial about how religious movements evolve from charismatic beginnings to institutional permanence. Rutherford was born in Missouri in 1869, 17 years after Russell. He studied law, practiced as an attorney, and served as a substitute judge, which gave him the title Judge Rutherford that he would use for the rest of his life. When he encountered Russell's movement, he brought a lawyer's mind to religious organization, structured, hierarchical, centralized, and absolutely intolerant of ambiguity or dissent. After Russell's death, there was a power struggle. Russell had been the undisputed leader, the prophetic voice, the authoritative interpreter. His passing left a vacuum. And in organizational history, vacuums don't last long. Either they're filled deliberately or they're filled chaotically. Rutherford ensured it would be the former, and that he would be the one doing the filling. Within months of taking control, Rutherford began reshaping the organization. He consolidated power, removed potential rivals, and established a governance structure that placed ultimate authority in the hands of a small group of men at headquarters, with himself as the unquestioned leader. And Bethel, the physical headquarters, became the symbol and instrument of this centralization. Under Rutherford, Bethel underwent a metamorphosis that would define it for the next century. What had been conceived as a home for dedicated Christians became the command center of a global religious corporation. What had been informal and familial became regimented and institutional. What had been voluntary service became something more complicated, something that looked like employment but was presented as sacred calling. Think about what this required. Rutherford needed to create a system where people would work full-time, often in demanding conditions, for minimal compensation, while feeling privileged to do so. He needed workers who would accept strict discipline, long hours, and limited personal freedom while considering themselves blessed rather than exploited. He needed to build an organizational culture where sacrifice was celebrated, where questioning was suppressed, and where loyalty to the organization became indistinguishable from loyalty to God. And Bethel, both as physical space and institutional culture, became the perfect mechanism for this transformation. Because when you live and work in the house of God, when you wake up every morning in rooms dedicated to the most important work on earth, when you eat in dining rooms surrounded by others who've made the same choice, when your entire social world exists within those walls, when your identity becomes inseparable from your institutional role, something happens to your perspective. The building itself becomes your teacher. The routine becomes your doctrine. The system becomes your reality. And gradually, imperceptibly, your ability to imagine life outside those walls diminishes. Not because you're physically prevented from leaving, you can walk out anytime, but because psychologically, you've been integrated into a system that makes leaving feel like spiritual suicide. This is the brilliance and the danger of total institutions, a concept sociologist Irving Goffman explored in his work on asylums, prisons, and military installations. Total institutions are places where people live and work in isolation from the wider society, where all aspects of life are conducted in the same place under the same authority, where daily activities are tightly scheduled and controlled, and where there's a fundamental split between a large managed group, inmates, recruits, patients, and a small supervisory staff. Bethel fits this pattern perfectly. It's not a prison. People choose to go there, and they're free to leave. But the psychological mechanisms are similar. You're separated from normal society. Your time is structured by others. Your activities are supervised. Your social world contracts to include primarily others in the same situation. And gradually, the institution becomes not just where you are but who you are. By the 1920s and 30s, under Rutherford's iron leadership, Bethel had evolved into a highly disciplined operation. There were schedules to keep, quotas to meet, standards to maintain. The literature production accelerated dramatically. The Watchtower magazine became the voice of authority for a rapidly growing global movement, with Rutherford's strident, aggressive style replacing Russell's more conciliatory approach. And Bethel workers, those who'd given up conventional careers to serve, became the elite core of this spiritual army. Rutherford made other changes that would have lasting impact. He introduced the term Jehovah's Witnesses in 1931, replacing Bible students, and creating a more distinctive brand identity. He shifted the theological emphasis from Russell's complex chronological calculations to a simpler message of divine sovereignty and organizational loyalty. He established the practice of going door to door as the primary method of evangelism, creating an army of unpaid evangelists who would become the public face of the movement. And through all of this, Bethel remained the center, the heart, the visible manifestation of divine blessing and organizational success. The buildings grew. The operations expanded. The workforce increased. And for young witnesses looking at their lives and wondering what they could do that would really matter, that would really count for something in the cosmic scheme, Bethel service began to shine as the ultimate goal, the highest calling, the most meaningful way to spend your life. But here's where we need to pause and consider what was being offered to these young people, because understanding the appeal is crucial to understanding why the eventual sense of broken promises would cut so deep. Imagine you're a young person in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, or even into the modern era. You've been raised to believe, or you've come to believe, that the world is fundamentally corrupt and temporary. You've been taught that it's ending soon, maybe not tomorrow, but soon, within your lifetime, possibly within a few years. You've been convinced that conventional pursuits like career advancement, wealth accumulation, advanced education, and even marriage and family are meaningless distractions in light of the coming kingdom of God. You've been shown statistics and charts and biblical chronologies that seem to prove that the end is imminent. You've been told that there's one organization on earth that has truth, one work that matters above all others, one way to survive the coming destruction. And you've internalized this not as abstract theology but as urgent, practical reality. Now imagine being offered a chance to serve at Bethel. Not just to be part of the organization, not just to be a regular member attending meetings and going door to door in your spare time, but to serve at its heart, at headquarters, at the place where decisions are made and truth is published. To live in the house of God itself. This isn't presented as a job. It's presented as a calling, as the highest privilege a young witness could aspire to. You're not joining a workforce. You're joining a spiritual elite. You're not accepting employment. You're answering a divine invitation. You're not just working for an organization. You're working directly for Jehovah God Himself. And the sacrifice required makes it more valuable, not less. This is crucial to understand. The difficulty isn't a deterrent, it's part of the appeal. Give up your career prospects. Give up financial security. Give up the possibility of marriage and family, in many cases, or at least postpone it indefinitely. Live in shared rooms with limited privacy. Work long hours at physically demanding tasks. Accept minimal compensation, room, board, and a small monthly allowance. Follow strict rules about conduct, dress, grooming, association, entertainment, and personal time. All of this sacrifice becomes proof of authenticity. If it were easy, it wouldn't mean anything. The difficulty becomes evidence of value. The demands become validation that this really is different, really is special, really is the most important thing you could do with your life. You're not just working, you're offering your life as a living sacrifice, and every hardship is evidence of the offering's sincerity. This is the psychology of costly signaling, and it's extraordinarily powerful. When something requires significant sacrifice to obtain or maintain, we tend to value it more highly. We justify the sacrifice by inflating the value of what we've sacrificed for. And we become resistant to evidence that the sacrifice might not have been worth it, because accepting that would mean accepting that we've wasted our time, our energy, our opportunities, our lives. And Bethel, the building complex, reinforced this narrative every single day. The buildings were solid, impressive, well-maintained, strategically located. They spoke of permanence and success and divine favor. Walking into the Brooklyn Bethel complex, you weren't walking into some struggling operation held together with duct tape and hope. You were walking into facilities that looked like they'd been blessed with divine favor, that communicated competence and success and permanence. The architecture preached a sermon without words. It said, "This work is established. This work is growing. This work is succeeding. This work is going somewhere. And you're part of it." For a young idealist, that validation is intoxicating. It answers the deepest human need for meaning and significance. It provides identity, community, purpose, and the profound satisfaction of being part of something larger than yourself. It offers a grand narrative in which you're not just a minor character but an essential participant. You're not just living your life, you're helping to fulfill biblical prophecy. You're not just working, you're serving God Himself. The daily routine at Bethel reinforced this sense of purpose. Morning worship, with scriptural discussion and organizational updates. Breakfast in the dining hall, surrounded by fellow workers all committed to the same cause. Work assignments that contributed directly to the global preaching work, whether in the printery, the shipping department, the offices, the laundry, the kitchen, the cleaning crews. Lunch with your fellow workers. More work in the afternoon. Dinner. Perhaps some time for personal Bible study or preparation for the weekly Watchtower study. Meetings at local congregations. Weekend preaching work in the New York area. Every day was structured. Every hour had purpose. There was no drift, no aimlessness, no wondering whether your life mattered. Of course it mattered. You could see the evidence. The magazines and books rolling off the presses. The boxes being prepared for shipment around the world. The letters coming in from grateful readers. The growth statistics announced at assemblies. You were part of a movement that was changing the world, saving lives, fulfilling divine purpose. And beyond the individual satisfaction, there was the community. Bethel created deep bonds between workers. You lived together, worked together, ate together, worshiped together, faced the same challenges together. You shared a common vocabulary, common experiences, common commitments. Friendships formed that would last decades. Romances developed, leading to marriages. A sense of family emerged, often deeper than biological family ties, because these were people who truly understood your choices, your sacrifices, your faith. This community aspect cannot be overstated, because it's one of the most powerful retention mechanisms any organization can create. When your entire social world exists within the institution, when your closest friendships are with fellow workers, when your identity is bound up with your institutional role, leaving becomes almost unthinkable. You wouldn't just be leaving a job, you'd be leaving your entire world, your entire identity, your entire community. But there's a shadow side to this dynamic that we need to examine carefully, because it's at the heart of why so many former Bethel workers use the language of broken promises when they look back on their experience. The promise was never fully articulated in explicit terms. Nobody signed a contract that said, "Sacrifice your 20s and 30s at Bethel, and in return you'll be taken care of for life." There was no written guarantee of lifelong support. No pension plan. No retirement benefits. No healthcare coverage beyond what Bethel provided while you were actively serving. But the promise was there, implicit in every talk, every Watchtower article, every conversation with elders who encouraged young people to pursue Bethel service. The promise was woven into the culture, embedded in the stories told, present in the examples held up for admiration. The implicit promise went something like this: if you give your life to this work, if you sacrifice your most productive years, if you forego career development and wealth accumulation and conventional family life, you're making an investment in something eternal. You're storing up treasure in heaven, yes, but also you're becoming part of a system that will value you, that will recognize your sacrifice, that will care for you. There was a social contract, even if it was never written down. You give everything. The organization provides security. You sacrifice your independence. The organization becomes your family. You set aside your future. The organization becomes your future. You trust the system. The system takes care of you. This wasn't just assumption on the part of workers. It was reinforced by organizational rhetoric. Articles in the Watchtower spoke of Bethel as a family. Talks at assemblies praised longtime Bethel workers as examples of faithfulness. Stories were told of elderly workers being cared for in their final years. The message was clear: if you give yourself to this work, you'll never be abandoned. And for decades, this seemed to work, at least from the outside. Bethel kept growing. Workers kept arriving, giving their years, and eventually either leaving to serve elsewhere or staying on as long-time workers. The system seemed sustainable. The promise seemed real. In 1973, the organization opened a massive printing facility in Wallkill, New York, about 90 miles northwest of Brooklyn. This wasn't a small upgrade, it was a major expansion, with state-of-the-art printing equipment capable of producing literature on a scale that would have been unimaginable in Russell's day. The Wallkill facility eventually included not just printing operations, but also residential facilities for workers, offices, and beautiful grounds that were used for tours and promotional purposes. The opening of Wallkill was presented as evidence of divine blessing, proof that the organization was growing, thriving, advancing. And for Bethel workers, both in Brooklyn and at the new facility, this expansion validated their sacrifice. Look at what's being accomplished. Look at how the work is advancing. Look at the evidence that we're on the right path. In 1992, another major expansion, Paterson, New York, became home to the Watchtower Educational Center. This facility focused on training future elders, missionaries, and organization men. It included a large auditorium, residential facilities, offices, and eventually became the location for producing the organization's audio and video content. Again, this was presented as evidence of progress, blessing, advancement. The organization wasn't contracting, it was expanding. It wasn't declining, it was thriving. And your sacrifice as a Bethel worker was contributing to this success. Each new facility reinforced the narrative. Each expansion was presented in organizational literature with the same message: look at what Jehovah is blessing. Look at how the work is advancing. Look at the evidence that we're on the right path. Look at what your sacrifice is helping to accomplish. And for Bethel workers, this was deeply personal. Your sacrifice was producing visible results. The literature you helped produce was reaching millions. The buildings you helped maintain were expanding. The organization you served was conquering the world with its message. The numbers presented at annual meetings showed constant growth in publishers, congregations, countries where the work was established. Everything pointed in the same direction. Up and to the right. Growth. Success. Divine blessing. But beneath this triumphant narrative, something else was happening, something that wouldn't become fully visible for decades. And to understand it, we need to look at what was changing in the larger world and how those changes would eventually impact Bethel and its workers. The late 20th century brought massive changes to publishing, manufacturing, and organizational operations. The rise of digital technology meant that printing operations that once required hundreds of workers could be done with a fraction of the workforce. The Internet changed how information was distributed, making physical literature less central to communication. Globalization meant that production could be distributed internationally, with printing done in different countries rather than centralized in the United States. At the same time, the cost of maintaining large facilities in expensive urban areas like Brooklyn was increasing dramatically. Waterfront property in Brooklyn, once industrial and relatively affordable, became some of the most valuable real estate in the world. The gentrification of Brooklyn neighborhoods meant that property taxes, insurance costs, and maintenance expenses were skyrocketing. Meanwhile, the workforce at Bethel was aging. People who had arrived in their 20s in the 1960s and 70s were now in their 60s and 70s. They weren't as physically capable of demanding manual labor. They required more health care. They represented, from a purely organizational perspective, increasing costs with decreasing productivity. And here's where the architectural symbolism reveals its darker side. Those impressive buildings, those solid structures that preached permanence and blessing, they required enormous resources to maintain. Every dollar spent on maintaining aging infrastructure in expensive Brooklyn was a dollar not available for other organizational priorities. Bethel was becoming less about people and more about efficiency. The organizational needs began to take precedence over the individual needs of workers. The machine had to keep running, and the machine was getting bigger, more expensive, more complex. And a workforce of aging volunteers, no matter how dedicated, represented both an asset and a liability. An asset because they worked for minimal compensation. A liability because they aged, they got sick, they needed care, and they had given up the conventional careers that would have provided them with retirement savings, healthcare, and financial security. The organization had built a system that relied on young workers cycling through, giving their prime years, and then... what? The what was never clearly defined. And that ambiguity, that lack of explicit planning for what happens to lifelong workers when they're no longer physically capable of the demanding work, that's where the broken promise lives. Some long-time workers were reassigned to lighter duties. Some were cared for in the Bethel infirmary. Some, as they aged into their 80s and 90s, did receive care until they died. But others, particularly those who weren't quite old enough or sick enough to require full-time medical attention, but who were no longer able to meet the demands of their work assignments, found themselves in an increasingly ambiguous situation. And then came the changes that would crystallize these tensions into something impossible to ignore. In 2016, the organization made a move that symbolized everything that was changing. After over a century in Brooklyn, after decades of telling people that Brooklyn Bethel was the spiritual heart of God's organization on earth, headquarters moved to Warwick, New York. The stated reasons were practical and, on the surface, entirely reasonable. The new Warwick facility was custom-built for the organization's current needs. It had modern infrastructure, better facilities, more efficient layout. The Brooklyn properties were sold for enormous sums, hundreds of millions of dollars, generating wealth that would support the organization's operations for years to come. From a business perspective, the move made perfect sense. Sell expensive, aging urban properties for maximum profit. Build new, efficient facilities in a less expensive location. Streamline operations. Reduce overhead. But for many who had given their lives to Brooklyn Bethel, this move felt like something beyond logistics. It felt like a statement about the nature of permanence, about the reliability of promises, about what could be trusted. For decades, Brooklyn had been presented as more than just a location. It was world headquarters. It was the house of God. It was the place from which divine direction flowed to the entire world. Articles, talks, and publications had reinforced the special nature of Brooklyn Bethel. Tours were given. Visitors from around the world would make pilgrimages to see the facilities. For many witnesses, visiting Brooklyn Bethel was a spiritual high point, evidence that this was real, that the organization was blessed, that they were part of something divinely guided. And now, with barely a decade's warning, it was over. Brooklyn Bethel, after more than a century, was being abandoned. The buildings were being sold to worldly developers. The special nature, the sacred geography, the permanence that had been implied for generations, gone. For someone in their 20s or 30s, this might be manageable. Change happens. Organizations adapt. Life goes on. But for someone in their 50s or 60s, who had spent their entire adult life at Brooklyn Bethel, who had absorbed the message that this was permanent, who had made irreversible life choices based on the stability implied by the organization's presence in Brooklyn, this was shattering. And alongside this move came other changes. Reductions in Bethel populations worldwide. Restructuring that led to many long-time workers being sent home, reassigned to the field, given a modest stipend and told to rebuild lives they had set aside decades earlier. The organization framed this as simplification, as making better use of resources, as adapting to new realities. And from an organizational perspective, these were reasonable adaptations. The world had changed. Technology had changed. The needs were different. But for the individuals affected, the language of organizational efficiency rang hollow against the reality of their situations. You're 55 years old. You've been at Bethel since you were 22. You have no retirement savings. You have no career history outside of menial Bethel work assignments. You have no professional network. You may have minimal education because you were encouraged to skip college to pursue Bethel service. And now you're being sent out with a small stipend, maybe a few $1,000s, and encouragement to continue serving Jehovah in a local congregation. You're expected to find housing, find work, rebuild a financial life, all while maintaining your faith that the organization that's sending you away is still God's organization, still worthy of your loyalty, still entitled to your support. The broken promise isn't about the buildings changing. It's about what those changes revealed, that the implicit social contract could be rewritten at any time, that decades of sacrifice didn't guarantee security, that the organization's needs would always supersede individual needs, no matter how faithful the individual had been, no matter how much they'd given up, no matter how much they believed the implied promises. And this is where we need to be very careful and very clear. Organizations change. Business needs evolve. Strategic decisions have to be made. No one can reasonably expect a religious organization to maintain facilities or workers purely for sentimental reasons if the resources could be better used elsewhere. That's not sustainable for any organization, religious or secular. The problem isn't that the organization changed. The problem is the gap between how Bethel service was sold and what the organizational commitment actually was. It's the difference between give your life to God's work and you'll be taken care of, and work for us while you're useful and when organizational needs change, you're on your own. If Bethel had been presented honestly from the beginning, we need workers for a season. Give us some years and when our needs change or you're no longer able to serve, you'll need to make other arrangements. That would be one thing. People could make informed decisions. They could plan accordingly. They could serve for a time and then move on with realistic expectations. But that's not how it was presented. Bethel service was wrapped in sacred language. It was presented as answering a divine calling, as offering your life to God, as making yourself available for God's use. The sacrifice was sacralized. The commitment was spiritualized. And the promise, while never explicitly stated, was deeply implied. This is a family, and families don't abandon their own. This is why understanding the origin of Bethel matters so much. Because the origin shows us how symbols are created, how authority is established, how promises are implied without being stated, and how psychological architecture works to make unthinkable sacrifices feel not just acceptable but desirable. Charles Russell created the vision of a house of God, where dedicated Christians could serve together. Joseph Rutherford transformed that vision into a disciplined organizational system. Subsequent leaders maintained and expanded that system, always presenting growth as evidence of divine favor, always using the physical structures as proof that the organization was blessed, stable, and worthy of complete trust. But systems, unlike buildings, are invisible. You can see impressive architecture, but you can't see the policies that determine who gets taken care of and who gets sent away. You can see expansion, but you can't see the financial calculations that determine when workers become liabilities instead of assets. You can see the house of God, but you can't see the organizational machinery that makes decisions based on efficiency rather than loyalty, on current needs rather than past sacrifice. And for the individual who gave everything, who believed the implicit promises, who structured their entire life around being part of this sacred work, the realization that they were part of a system rather than part of a family is a wound that buildings can't heal and organizational explanations can't close. This is what makes the Bethel story so important to understand, especially now, especially as more and more former workers are finding their voices and telling their stories. Because their experience reveals something fundamental about how high-control organizations function, about how idealism can be channeled into institutional loyalty, about the human cost when the system's needs conflict with the people's needs, and about the enduring impact of broken promises, even when those promises were never written down. Bethel USA wasn't built to trap people. Nobody was forced to go there. Nobody was prevented from leaving. It was built to inspire people, to give physical form to a vision of divine purpose and human sacrifice. It was built to say, this is real. This matters. This is worth your life. And for many thousands of people over more than a century, that's exactly what they believed. They gave their lives. They gave their youth, their health, their possibilities, their alternative futures. They gave everything because they believed in the promise, even when the promise was never written down, even when it was communicated more through architecture and atmosphere than through explicit covenant. So was Bethel built to serve people, or was it built to serve a system that would eventually serve itself? That's the question each viewer will have to answer for themselves. But the evidence is there in the stories, in the patterns, in what happened when organizational needs conflicted with human needs, in who was protected and who was let go, in which promises were kept and which were quietly forgotten. The house of God was built on sacred language and organizational efficiency. It promised meaning and demanded sacrifice. It offered community and created dependency. It spoke of permanence while maintaining the flexibility to change whenever organizational needs required it. And the people who gave their lives to that house, who believed in what it represented, who trusted the implied covenant, they're the ones left to reconcile the distance between what they believed they were promised and what the organizational reality actually delivered. If you lived Bethel from the inside, if you know someone who gave decades to that service, if you felt the weight of promises that were implied but never guaranteed, the comments are open. This is a conversation that needs to happen. These are stories that deserve to be told and heard without shame, without dismissal, without the defensive reactions that so often shut down honest discussion. Because Bethel USA wasn't just a building in Brooklyn. It was an idea about commitment and calling, about sacrifice and significance, about what it means to give your life to something you believe is sacred. And when that idea collides with the reality of organizational change and institutional priorities, the impact doesn't just affect budgets and buildings and operational efficiency. It affects human lives, human hopes, human futures, and human hearts. In the next video, we're going deeper into what changed, when it changed, and why so many began to feel that the promise they believed in was never the promise that existed. Because understanding the origin is just the beginning. Understanding what broke, when it broke, and why it mattered, that's where the real story lives. That's where the pain is. And that's where the healing, if it comes, must start.